There's many times that I wish I was running the UFC.
Hell nah. So I'm sure you've recently seen the podcast with Joe Rogan and Ilia Topuria, and I actually quite like the podcast, apart from every single time that Joe Rogan tried telling us about how he thinks the UFC should be. I'm going to be looking at what the UFC would look like if Joe Rogan was actually in charge. And I made a video last week about Joe Rogan's worst takes, but this was before I saw the podcast with him and Ilia Topuria. And I know Guru's done a video breaking down the awful takes that Joe Rogan went through with that podcast with Ilia Topuria. And I feel like us as MMA YouTubers need to team up as like the Avengers and take down Joe Rogan, this germ that has expired in the MMA community and brings nothing viable anymore, and his awful UFC takes as how he thinks the UFC should look nowadays. Because nowadays in the UFC, you know what you get in. An octagon, a happy crowd when there's a good fight on, fighters, everybody knows the deal with the UFC, but Joe Rogan seems to think he's got some own rules that the UFC should implement.
I think they should fight in a cage.
Yeah?
Be in like a basketball court. Like a basketball court that's matted up.
So Joe Rogan has a problem with the current octagon in the UFC and thinks it should be replaced with a fucking basketball court. Like, who watches the UFC and thinks, you know, something's missing, there's something off with this, there's something not quite right. A fucking basketball court is the issue with this. So the first change is that he thinks the octagon should be removed. The octagon that has served us since the first ever UFC event in history has taken so many iconic moments throughout MMA history, is basically a staple in every mixed martial arts big organization. And when you think of MMA, you think of UFC, you think of the octagon. Nobody's ever had a problem with the octagon, but Joe Rogan thinks the basketball court should be the new thing. Yeah, basketball. That's going to solve all the UFC's biggest problems. With everything going on right now in the UFC, a fucking basketball court is going to be the biggest change to the UFC. The pros of this, I can't think of any pros. The cons, it confuses fans, it removes a staple of MMA, and fights become 10 times boring. Imagine fights actually taking place in like a basketball court. Can you imagine like a Sean Strickland in like a basketball court? I can't think of any benefits this will bring to the UFC. It just confuses fans, removes a staple of MMA, and fights become 10 times boring. Maybe this is Joe Rogan's plan, but out of all the issues in the UFC, I fail to see how a basketball court is going to save the UFC. But Joe Rogan's got an even better idea, apparently.
No stand-ups, ever. A part of the show, but I don't give a fuck about that. That's tough shit.
So Joe Rogan thinks that when a fighter gets taken down and you can't get back up, and they're essentially just stalling, they should be able to stay on the ground and not get taken back up.
And the audience, the unschooled
they don't know
mouth breathers amongst us.
I love the idea of Joe Rogan just watching a really boring fight in the UFC where there's a fighter obviously stalling, not much action going on, and him pretending that we need more of this. And I feel like it's a recurring theme with Joe Rogan, where he kind of likes to disguise himself as a hardcore. And we're going to get into this a lot as well. So change number 2 to the UFC, apparently, according to Joe Rogan, is no stand-ups for stalling. So when a fighter's obviously stalling, they've taken their opponent down, they're not looking for submissions, they're not looking to deal damage, they're not looking to end the fight. Joe Rogan thinks that they should not be stood up, they should not have a point taken, and it's tough shit, and he doesn't care if the fans hate it and if it's going to absolutely drive the sport into the dirt. The pros of this, I'm not trying to cherry pick anything here. I can't think of any pros. Maybe you guys have pros, but I can't think of a single pro for this rule. The cons, again, fights become extremely boring. Lay and pray becomes the new meta. The sport would be dead within 4 weeks. I mean, look at the current UFC fan base. Most casuals these days despise grappling. They think grappling's killing the UFC. Can you imagine how bad it would be if lay and pray was the new meta in the UFC because big old Joe Rogan doesn't care about the fan reception and doesn't care about how fans think? I can't think of any pros to this idea, but it is what it is. That's Joe Rogan for you.
So it's weird that you can't hit the back of the head.
So if getting taken down and not being able to get back up in any circumstance in a fucking basketball court isn't bad enough, getting hit on the back of the head is Joe Rogan's next assumption for the next big thing in the UFC. Back of the head shots.
It's like...
So change number 3 to Joe Rogan, the genius himself, is to legalize back of the head shots. I mean, what a genius, Joe Rogan. I mean, why hasn't anybody thought of this before? Hitting people on the back of the head, sending them into comas, sending them into critical injury. What a genius by Joe Rogan. He thinks back of the head shots in sequences should be legal. The pros of this, actually, it's surprising there actually is a pro. And it is that there probably be more finishes. And I'm talking about the finishing of lives, not the finishing of fights. There probably would be more finishes. You've got an extra place to hit. It's going to deal a lot more damage. It's probably going to send people into a lot more than just an unconscious state, but there'll be more finishes. The cons of this, fatalities in the octagon, life-threatening injuries, fighters taking lifelong damage to brain in a single sequence.
I'm a hardcore fan. I'm a purist. I think it should be about fighting, about elite fighting.
Maybe this is Joe Rogan's plan. Maybe he wants to see death in the octagon. I'm not sure what Joe Rogan wants, but I'm pretty sure this would lead to a UFC fatality lawsuit where at some point somebody would get critically injured and the UFC would deal with a massive lawsuit. And for a guy in Joe Rogan that's been involved in combat sports for years now, decades, he's been involved with the UFC, and he doesn't understand the danger of back of the head shots, it's massively surprising for me. We're going to see someone get knocked out cold in the octagon and probably not get back up. And because of the lawsuit, we're probably going to get brought to an apex. Do you think the UFC can afford to do a sold-out basketball court after they're dealing with a lawsuit due to a critically injured fighter? We're gonna have to find an apex for a basketball court to kill the atmosphere anymore. So far we've only 3 changes under Joe Rogan's rule. The sports become insanely boring, fun fights are rare, fighters become seriously injured, and the UFC would be dealing with heavy lawsuits. But surely it can't get any worse than this, right, Joe Rogan?
Is it unrealistic to put gloves on someone and tape their wrist up when we don't give them any other...
So Joe Rogan thinks if this isn't bad enough and if this isn't good enough for Joe Rogan, bare knuckle should be allowed. Back of the headshots with bare knuckle. I mean, Joe Rogan's a genius. So change number 4 is remove the gloves, BKFC style. Primal Joe Rogan over here, the guy who eats elk meat every day, thinks that bare knuckle should be the case in the UFC. There's too much protection for the UFC. Bare knuckle needs to be the way. Back of the headshots in a fucking basketball court. I mean, bare knuckle is the way. All the active fighters in the UFC, the fighters that we'll act on a regular basis, we get prepared to see them once a year because they ain't fighting multiple times a year with broken knuckles. Kevin Holland, see you once a year, buddy. And I don't think Joe Rogan understands that gloves are there to mainly protect the hands, not the face. But again, for a guy that's been involved in the UFC and MMA for like decades now, I don't understand how he hasn't really picked up on this. The pros of this, I mean, they're probably the more brutality. And bare knuckle, we've seen Masvidal's bare knuckle promotion. There'd probably be more blood, more brutality. That Just Bleed fella who was back in the stands 20 years ago would probably be loving this current stage of the UFC if there was bare knuckle fighting. The cons, fighters will always be injured. There'd be too many doctor stoppages and fighters would be fighting too cautiously. I can't imagine fighters would be going out there and swinging with broken knuckles because they'd be too cautious about getting hit and obviously breaking their knuckles. So I actually think this could actually deteriorate the quality of fights. But Joe Rogan knows better than anyone else. He's a hardcore fan, as he said in his own words. So we better believe Joe Rogan. And I also don't understand. I swear Joe Rogan used to have like a Taekwondo career before the UFC. And you look at why he quit Taekwondo. It's because he was like traumatized after he knocked somebody out. So let me get this straight. He quit Taekwondo due to a fear of knockouts, but he wants to see back of the headshots in bare knuckle on a basketball court in the UFC. Does this sound like a mentally sane person? And people like to go for Dana White a lot of the time. Oh, Dana White, raise the fighter pay, make better fights. O'Malley versus Murad, blah, 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 blah. Everyone likes to attack Dana White. Can you imagine with what Joe Rogan's coming out with if he was in charge of the UFC? It would go to the shitters. So a summary of Joe Rogan in charge. Let's go through step by step what Joe Rogan wants. So first of all, he wants to replace the octagon for a basketball court. He's got his priorities straight. Number 2, advocate stolen in the UFC. That's just what we need. Number 3, legalize back of the headshots. There's not enough, I guess, death in the UFC. Number 4, after getting sued, worsen the venue. We need to find a basketball apex. And number 5, back of the head isn't brutal enough. It's not brutal enough for primal Joe Rogan over here. Bare knuckle is what's needed. This looks like a fucking schizo episode. This looks like a dementia patient has done this. It looks like one of those Russian shows. Those guys who are beating the crap out of people in like telephone boxes. This seems like a product of that. Why does Joe Rogan think this way? Because he's been involved in the UFC for so long, like I said multiple times in this video. He's been through multiple different generations, multiple different eras. Joe Rogan is kind of like the face of the UFC sometimes. But I feel like since 2018, Joe Rogan's ability to expand MMA knowledge has just expired. Apart from having a funny reaction and being having a big name value, it doesn't really bring anything to commentary. And I saw Guru say this in his video as well, and it's so true. Joe Rogan just kind of has a soundboard that he kind of clicks, and it's the same thing every pay-per-view. People forget, man, I think this rule should change. And there's a bunch of different soundboards that Joe Rogan likes to click, and he'll just splurt something out, and it's the same thing that he says every pay-per-view. And he claims he's a hardcore fan. He's got such an easy commentary schedule. He doesn't commentate fight nights. He doesn't commentate pay-per-views outside the USA. He only ever commentates pay-per-views in the USA. Rogan only commentated 9 out of 42 events in 2024, but he's a hardcore fan. You're not a hardcore fan, mate. You really think Joe Rogan's at home watching fucking Lerone Murphy or Josh Emmett in his free time? 100% not. My overall thoughts is that I think the UFC are doing just fine right now without Joe Rogan in charge, and I think Rogan's fun, but he brings nothing extra to the UFC. So let me know your thoughts on what if Joe Rogan was in charge of the UFC. Do you think this would save the UFC as Joe Rogan probably thinks, or do you think this would drive the sport into the ground? Let me know your thoughts. Thank you for watching.